Hello, this is Jim Hoorman. I'm with Hoorman Soil Health Services, and today our topic is going to be on the biology of soil compaction. Just to give you a little bit of information about myself, I worked for the Ohio State University for 24 years as a county extension educator, and then I worked for 3 years for USDA NRCS as a soil health specialist. And we're going to talk a little bit about the biology of soil compaction. Okay. So when we look at soil, it's made out of a number of different things. First, the main portion is the inorganic. That's the mineral portion of the soil. It's about 45% in an ideal soil. Another 5% is that organic matter. And organic matter can range anywhere from 2 up to about 6%, but it's probably one of the most important components of your soil. Every 1% organic matter by weight takes up about 5% of the volume of the soil. So if you have a 2% organic matter soil, you've got maybe 10% of the volume taken up by that organic matter, whereas if you have a 6%, now you have 30%. And so it does make a big difference, and that's going to have an impact on your pore space. About 50% of an ideal soil should be pore space, and about half of that is both air and water. Here's a slide that shows some of the common soil bulk densities. And when we're looking at bulk density, what we're looking at is the weight divided by the volume. And the bigger the number, the more dense and the less pore space a soil has. Now, there is a limit on how dense anything can become. If you look at concrete, at 2.4 grams per centimeter cubed, the maximum is about 2.65. So when we start looking at some of these soils, especially like in an undisturbed woodlot, we actually have 1 to about 1.2 grams per centimeter cube. That means that if you're looking at that and you divide that into the 2.65, the mineral portion is actually less than 50%. Okay, so that's what we're looking for is bulk densities that allow us to get adequate air and water into the soil. You start looking at some of these clay and silt loams, it's up to 1.5 to 1.7, and that's more than 50% by weight. That's going to be the mineral portion, so you're going to have less than 50% pore space in your soil. Here's some soil texture and bulk density. So when we're talking soil texture, we're looking at the amount of sand, silt, and clay that's in a soil. And a lot of times sand just breaks down into silt, and silt breaks down into clay, and that's what determines your soil texture, okay? Your clay particles have a negative charge on it. And if you look at the bulk densities, you can see that ideal density for plant growth, the clay, than what it is for sandy soil. Sandy soil has much more open space, so it can get down to 1.6, and it can still, as long as it's less than 1.6, you're going to have good growth. But while in a clay, it doesn't take near as much. Bulk density, that really restricts your growth. It's about greater than 1.8 on a sand and right around 1.47 on a clay, with silt being in between. Here's a chart that kind of shows what's going on in our typical soil. I can go just about anywhere in the United States, and for that matter in the world, and we used to plow, and we can still find that plow pan. Most of the time, that plow pan starts somewhere around 6.5, 7 inches deep. And you'll notice that as we look at the bulk density, because we've tilled it and we've loosened that soil, it's right around 1.43. But then we hit this hard, dense area. So if we probe in the soil, we'll hit an area that's about 1.9. Well, on a clay soil, 1.1 is when the roots start to become restricted, 1.47 actually. So at 1.9, most of those roots are going to go down, and then they're going to go off at a right-hand angle. And we've got a couple inches there where it's real dense. And then once we get below that area, it actually is not quite as dense. In an undisturbed soil, it should just gradually get a little more dense as it goes down. So we can see that this soil has been greatly disturbed, and that's going to have an impact on both your air and your water movement. Soil organic matter, you can see here it has a weight of about 0.6. We like to say that soil organic matter is about like a sponge versus about 1.45 for, say, your regular soil. So again, when we're looking at bulk density, it's the mass or the weight divided by the volume. And since soil organic matter has less density than the soil, it has more space for air and water storage. Every pound of soil organic matter holds about 18 to 20 pounds of water, and it acts just like a sponge. Here's a couple of pictures that we can look at the soil underneath an electron microscope. And you can see on the left-hand side there where we have the soil organic matter particles, you can see these kind of black areas. Those are actually pore spaces for air and water to move. Compare that to the clay particles on the right-hand side, and you'll see how they're kind of stacked together and they're very dense. And the good thing about clay is it has a relatively high CEC, that's cation exchange capacity, has a negative charge. However, the soil organic matter on the left-hand side has almost 10 times higher CEC. It has more positive and negative charges that it can attract or chelate a lot of different positive and negative particles in the soil, which are our nutrients. So compacted soil, if we compare that, if it has a density of 1.6 to 1.8, just means it has a higher density. It doesn't allow as much space for air and water. Many times our dense soils kind of act like a road or pavement and result in flash floods. And we're starting to see that in our road, in a lot of our ditches. Right after a rain, we can get a 1-inch rain, a 2-inch rain, and we immediately see that ditch, the water in the ditch come up quite abruptly, but it doesn't last real long, and then it'll go back down. So that's what we call these flashiness or flash floods. Dense soils also have less microbial life and biological life in them, so it's not as good place to raise your crops. There are 3 different factors that will compact our soil. Most of the engineers will concentrate on the heavy equipment. Heavy equipment does compact the soil, but you might be surprised. A raindrop coming down at 30 miles per hour can really compact the soil, and so does gravity. One of the things when I was learning about this several years ago when I was working on a PhD is I was looking for, is there a visual way to measure soil compaction? And I noticed something. I was coming home from school, and I was looking at the fence rows, and there appears to be an elevation difference. So I talked to my advisor and to the professor, and he said, well, that's just because the soil has eroded. And I said, well, it's interesting. I took some measurements on the lee side of a woods, and I found anywhere from a 6 to 9 inch elevation difference. So I did some investigation and come to find out that our soils are compacted mainly because we've lost so much organic matter from them. Remember when I said organic matter every 1% takes up 5% by 1% by weight, but 5% by volume? We used to have 5 to 6% organic matter, and now we're down somewhere between 2, maybe 3%. So we've lost a tremendous volume in our soil. And so if you look at that 6 to 9 inches of elevation, if 50% of that was void space, that means we've lost anywhere from 3 to 4.5 inches of additional water storage in that soil profile. Here's just an example of that. This is a long-term no-till field compared to rotational tillage on the right. We had the same rainfall event on May 15th. We got 3/4 of an inch. And these fields were a Hoytville soil. They're less than 1/8 mile apart. And you can see where even by just doing rotational tillage, that would be no-till soybeans followed by tilled corn, you can see that we have water standing on that soil. Don Rogowski has commented that every time you till your soil, you lose about 80% of the benefits. And if you compare that to a long-term no-till system where we have long-term no-till soybeans, and in this case, strip-till corn, you can see that we don't have any standing water. Same rainfall event, less standing water. Now, interesting, this happens all over the country. So this is a Kansas road, and these fields are just maybe less than a half a mile apart. So on the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a no-till field, and there was a rainfall event there, and you don't see any standing water. Whereas you look at the other three slides that were very close, the pictures there, you can see that during this rainfall event that there's standing water. This is due to soil compaction, which is really just poor soil structure, which occurs from tillage. Okay, here's another one. On the left-hand side, long-term no-till, you don't see any pond and water, whereas on the right-hand side, this is in Brookings County, South Dakota, you can see that there's evidence of ponding water on this conventional tilled field. Another situation where we're starting to get gullies forming, and you can see that the water is coming off of there, and it's dirty. It's very black, which is full of nutrients. And if you compare that to the cover crop on the right-hand side, you'll see that where we had a cover crop, now this cover crop appears to be dead. This was probably taken in late winter, but it may be that it's still alive. Can't tell from this picture, but you can see that the water's a lot clearer and there's a lot less erosion. So these roots allow the water to infiltrate so that we have less soil erosion. The key isn't how much rainfall that we get, but what happens to it after it falls. It's how much you can infiltrate into your soils. That's what's important. So if you look at the bottom right, you'll see no-till with residue left on the surface, whereas in the upper right, you'll see the soil pores are disconnected. And it really is important how much organic matter that you have in your soil. The more organic matter you have, the more water that you can store. And so we have a couple slides that show that. So here's soil organic matter and available water capacity. This is inches of water per 1 foot of soil. So if we have a 1% sandy soil and has 1% organic matter in it, it can store about 1 acre inch. And if we compare that to a silt loam, it's about 1.9, and a silty clay loam is about 1.4. Now, as the organic matter goes up, we do lose a little bit of efficiency. So if you go all the way to the bottom and you look, now it's pretty hard to get 5% organic matter on a sand, but if you, based on this research, 5% organic matter can hold about 2.5 acre inches of water. If you divide the 5 into the 2.5, that's about a 0.5 compared to 1 at the top where we have 1% organic matter under the sand. Now, if you divide the 5 into the 4 on the silt loam, now we're at about 0.8, and 5 into the silty clay loam, 5 into the 3 acre inches of water. We're at about 0.6 acres of inch of water for every 1% organic matter. So it is important, the higher the organic matter, the more water you can store in the soil. When we look at infiltration, this is some research that was done at Ohio State University. And when we have a plowed, disked, cultivated, or bare surface, the water infiltration rate was about 1/4 of an inch, 0.26, okay? Well, did it go up or down once we went to no-till? Well, if you had a bare surface, the no-till actually went down and cut it in half, 0.11, okay? But adding that surface residue allows those pores to stay open so that they don't seal off. What we get is sealing on the soil surface. So under the no-till, where we have 40% cover, we go to 0.46, and if we get it up to 80% cover, we're at 1 acre inch of water that can infiltrate per hour. So it is very important to have that surface cover in order to allow the water to go down. When we look at where the water is uptake occurs with our plants, about 70% of that is going to occur in that top 12 inches, 40% in the top 6. If you add another 30% in that next 6 inches, so 70% of the water is absorbed in that surface. And if we seal that surface off, or if we have a compacted layer down there at the plow pan layer, then we have less access to water. But it also shows why crops can usually start out quite well, but then once we get into the summer and we have a dry period, we may not be able to get access to that other 10 to 30% water that is below that compacted layer. Nutrient extraction follows the water. So again, it's almost the exact same numbers. 40% of nutrient extraction occurs in the top 6 inches, an additional 30% in that next 6 inches, and 20%, almost 90% of the total nutrients are absorbed within 18 inches. But if you can get those roots down just a little bit deeper, you can gain another 10%, and that can be very important. Also, soil temperature. There's big differences with no-till and covers, and compared to conventional soils. Conventional soils, maybe this is a minimum till. You can see that when the sun beats down on it, the temperature goes up quite rapidly. It can go up to over 100 degrees. Whereas where we've got a little bit of cover and we've got live leaves there, shades the sun and the temperature is a lot lower. Well, this can be very important, especially during hot, dry summers. This information comes from Dr. Elwyn Taylor. For corn production, if your soil temperature is 75 degrees, you need 1 acre-inch of water per week. Once that soil temperature gets up to 85 degrees, it doubles. You got to go to 2 inches of water per week. And if it goes up another 10 degrees to 95 degrees, you need 4 acre-inches of water per week. So very simple relationship. You need 2 times the water requirement for every 10-degree increase in Fahrenheit in your soils. How much is a 1 acre-inch of rain that's fully used worth to you? It's worth about 8 bushels of corn, 6 bushels of wheat, and 3.5 bushels of soybeans. Generally, for 200 bushel corn, we need about 22 inches of water per year. Most years we're going to get that. Unfortunately, it may come down in 1, 2, 3, 4, even 5-inch rains. It's really the effective rainfall that we should be looking at. And in order to have effective rainfall, we've got to get that to infiltrate into the soil, and it's got to be stored. So 1 acre-inch fully used, if that's 8 bushels of corn, and this might be a little high, say $3 to $4, you're looking at $24 to $32 per acre just for a 1 acre-inch of water that's fully used. But heat and drought do quickly increase yield losses, so it's really important to have adequate water there. We're going to talk a little bit more about compaction. It's interesting, when we go across these fields, we see a lot of these ruts. And when we get deep ruts like this, we always think that we have to work. And what we're finding out is if when we have firmer soils where we have long-term no-till, we'll show you some pictures of that. Here's just some information about some of the dynamic properties of rooting volume on our soil. The arrangement of those soil particles has a big impact on root development and water infiltration. The biggest thing that you need to know is that compaction can reduce your yields up to 60%, and that compaction has been shown to persist for up to 9 years. And really what soil compaction is the absence of soil aggregation in pore space. And we'll show you a little bit more of the science on that in just a little bit. How do we increase root volume? Well, we have to promote that biological activity. We got to increase the organic matter, and long-term no-till undisturbed soils have the most pore space in them so that we can get better rooting value and better gas and water exchange. We want to prevent that soil from compacting. You got to stay off those wet soils. We've also found that the first time you go across these soils after it's been tilled, 80% of the soil compaction from the wheel traffic occurs on that first pass of a tire. This is, again, some research that was done at The Ohio State University. When you look at how tire ruts form, here's a picture that I had drawn up with Cheryl a couple years ago. I thought she did a pretty nice job here. But as a tractor tire goes across the soil, you'll notice that it kind of pushes down, and then it pushes out, and then there's this physical lifting of the soil because the soil doesn't have any place to go. Okay, so this is typically what a rut does. Now, interesting, when we go to try to fill in that rut, it seems like we always still have an indentation. And what this is we've compacted the soil. We got rid of the pore space. So disking is one of the worst things that you can do to a soil. It just absolutely pulverizes the soil, and it doesn't allow very much room for pore space. So That's one of the problems that we have with the tillage. The tillage is burning up the organic matter and taking out the pore space, causing poor soil structure, and that's what we call soil compaction. Now, interesting, when you look at a root, and this is a radish root, radish roots have volume too, and they actually do the same thing. That big root is pushing down, it's pushing the soil to the side, and then it's physically lifting that soil up. But the difference is when that radish decomposes, we're going to have, or any root for that matter, we're going to have pore space that's left. And what it's doing is it's giving off root exudates that are going to allow this soil to kind of cement itself together. So what we're looking at here is a lot of these are little microaggregates, and microaggregates are cemented together to give us macroaggregates. Macroaggregates are what we're looking for. That's all the sugars and glues in the soil, and that's what will allow that soil to crumble. If we get too many microaggregates, the microaggregates kind of seal the soil off and don't allow that soil to have water infiltration. So this was some test data that was taken at Dave Brandt's farm where he had Daikon radish, and we can see where we had an open field. We can see what the penetration resistance and bulk density was on the right-hand side compared to where we had the radish field. Compaction decreased by greater than 50% where we had these radishes. As a matter of fact, if you've got a good stand of radish, it's very seldom that you're going to see much standing water because they do a good job of letting that water into the soil. So again, all soil starts with microaggregate formation. This is 90% of this formation is dependent on the bacteria. 40 to 60% of the soil microbial biomass is associated with these microaggregates. That's mainly your bacteria. Bacteria are very important for starting the process of getting these clay particles to form microaggregates. The problem is in a heavy clay soil that's been tilled, you're going to be dominated by bacteria. And what we really want to do is have more fungus in the soil, the mycorrhizal fungus, which will allow us to form macroaggregates. And the macroaggregates are bigger and they're cemented together to allow air and water to get into our soil. So this is how it works. We take these individual clay particles, and what the roots do is they line up these clay particles and they actually compact the soil. And then there on the right-hand side, you'll see this group of clay particles. What happens is as the root gives off its root exudates, those are the glues that are going to form a bigger macro aggregate. And that's going to help to stabilize your soil. And everybody wants to have a macro aggregate in their soil because that allows the air and the water to get into your soil. So this is the difference between micro aggregates and macro aggregates. You can see the difference in size. The macro aggregates is just a bunch of micro aggregates. You've got some plant debris, some fungal debris. You might have some silt size micro aggregates, some clay microstructures, and all these are kind of cemented together to give us real good soil structure. That's what we're looking at. And then you'll have some pore space in there and some water that's being held in these macro aggregates. So the mycorrhizal fungi, what do? They're very beneficial. They're a keystone microbe in the soil. They're very important. They infect about 80 to 90% of our crops, especially corn, soybeans, and to a lesser extent wheat. But what they do is they infect that corn, and what they're doing is bringing back water and nutrients to that corn plant, and then the corn is going to give it sugars. And so what that what the fungus does is it's got something called glomalin inside its cell structure, and this glomalin's very sticky. This is what it looks like under a microscope, and it's going to surround these soil aggregates. So these little filaments that go through the soil are breaking down and basically spilling out its cell wall contents, which is this glomalin or glomulin, and that's what gives us soil a good soil structure. Okay, now it is water insoluble, which is a good thing because that allows it to shed water. but it can also tie up water inside of it. Okay, and so all these are really important for good soil structure. Building soil structure is a little bit like building a house. The architect is Mother Nature. The plants are kind of our carpenters along with the microbes. And then our foundation is our sand, our silt, and our clay. The frame for the house is the roots. And then the humus and the phosphorus. I always like to say that the humus is like a nail. It's hard as a rock. It's been around for a long time. The lag screws are your phosphorus. That's what allows the phosphorus will attach to those clay particles and kind of cement some of the clay particles to the humus, everything together. The nitrogen and the sulfur act like braces, give us a much stronger, with those double and triple bonds, it'll give us that carbon is very flexible, and so it makes that carbon so it's a little more stronger. And then the polysaccharides, the root exudates, and all the sugars kind of act like the insulation and the glue. And then the glomulins, kind of like your house wrap. And then we have a roof, which is made out of all the surface residues. So let's take a look at this. So building soil aggregates is like building a house. So on the right-hand side, you have the macroaggregate. And let's take a look at this house. So we start off with the foundation, which is your clay and silt and sand particles. And then if you look at any room in a house, most of the time it has studs or wood. And that's your organic matter in the soil. Well, organic matter by itself isn't very strong, so we're going to use some braces, the nitrogen and the sulfur, to make that a little firmer, okay? And then the last screw is kind of maybe the bricks on the outside of the house, which is your clay. That's going to be attached to the frame of the house. The nails are kind of your humus, which kind of tie everything together that has a lot of positive, negative charges, and it breaks down very slowly. And then that glomalin, it's kind of like the insulation, the glue, the house wrap. It goes all the way around that house and keeps it so it's nice and tight. It keeps a lot of things inside. That's that water insoluble structure. And then we have our roof, which is really just the surface residue on the soil. So let's think about this for a minute. What would happen if every other year we had a tornado? This tornado is called tillage. And if our roof was destroyed? Well, in a house, that will allow the rain to come in, and that's going to rot out the wood. Now, it's not the water that rots out the soil, the organic matter in our soil. It's too much oxygen. And when we get too much oxygen in the soil, the microbes break down the organic matter, and pretty soon our house or our macroaggregate now becomes rubble or microaggregates, and we lose a lot of pore space. So building soil or aggregates is like building a house, okay? And here's what's going on. Oxygen and carbon dioxide in the soil. Carbon dioxide's heavier than the oxygen. They're kind of inversely related. If one increases, the other decreases. If we get too much oxygen in the soil, what happens is that causes the carbon dioxide to be lost to the soil atmosphere. Well, if we do this tillage during when there's no plants there, that carbon dioxide goes way high up into the atmosphere and it gets carried off and it's not available to the plants. The roots act kind of like a biological valve. They help to control how much oxygen gets into the soil. They need a little more oxygen. They can actually shrink and swell a little bit to allow more oxygen to get into the soil. So oxidation, what does it do? When we get too much oxygen in, it's going to break down these macroaggregates. That's where all the sugars are. And then these sugars are going to be consumed by the bacteria, and then we're going to form microaggregates. Those microaggregates are going to set up kind of like a brick wall. And I'll do a little demonstration with that at the end of this presentation. Okay. Now, one of the things that I've heard a lot of farmers talk about is how cold and wet their soils are. And this seems to be on a kind of a time frame. So generally what I hear is when farmers first start to do no-till, they'll say that their soils are cold and wet. And yet when I talk to more experienced or farmers that have had long-term no-till and cover crops, they'll tell me that their soils are warm and moist. So is somebody lying or what's going on? Well, let's take a look at this. So let's say that we start off with a field that's been in conventional, okay? Well, did we get rid of all the compaction? No, we've got poor soil structure. So what's going to happen is coming out of the winter, we're going to have a lot of water there because the water cannot infiltrate or drain away very well, okay, if we have these hard pans. And water coming out of the winter is going to be very cold, and it takes 10 times more energy to warm up that soil. Now, once we start to get into no-till, we start to get the roots down, you're going to find that that soil is going to start to drain. Now, that might take 2, 3, 4, even 5 years, but once that soil starts to heal itself and we allow that cold water to be replaced by warmer air, we're going to find out that that soil is actually going to warm up. Now, I just said warmer air. If we get too much oxygen in the soil, we're going to break down the macroaggregates. The macroaggregates are always breaking down, always reforming, but because they have that insoluble coating around there, they're semi-protected, okay? So we can still keep our good soil structure, but with more live roots, we're going to just continually form and reform and break down and form and reform macroaggregates. Now, what happens after 1 or 2 or 3 years? Well, all of a sudden, that organic matter starts to turn black as it decomposes. Black absorbs the heat, so now your soils are going to start to warm up. And as you go out maybe 3, 4, 5, 7 years, maybe we start to get a thicker layer of residue at the surface. Now, most of my farmers tell me that it's very hard to keep residue once you get the biological life in your soil, but where you have this nice residue, what do we find in a compost pile? We find with biological life that the soil is a little bit warmer. So that's why our long-term no-tillers say that their soil is warm and moist, a perfect place to plant your corn and soybeans, while beginning farmers that are just starting with no-till and still have a lot of compaction, they say their soils are cold and wet. You got to give it a little time to heal. Okay, why do our soils compact? Well, look at your crop rotation. Beans, especially drilled beans, have a very poor root system. They're very hard on the soil. Corn adds a lot more organic matter and has thicker roots that can really limit that plow layer and start to break it up. What percentage of the time you have to look at, do you have live roots in the soil? You're just doing no-till by itself in a corn-soybean rotation, you may only have live roots out there 4 months out of 12 or about a third of the time. So we're only putting carbon, especially the root exudates and the microbial products, because the microbes live right with the live roots, only about a third of the time. So you're not going to have as good a soil structure compared to where you have long-term no-till with the cover crop. Does the no-till, no cover crop have more live roots than conventional tillage? The answer is maybe a little, but not really that much more. So what's missing in a no-till system with no cover crops? You got to have the live roots. So that's the importance of the cover crops. Matter of fact, I made the observation that really no-till is maybe 30 to 40% of the solution. It's not until we get that additional set of roots. We got maybe our corn plus the cover crops, and then if we go to soybeans and we put cereal rye in front of that soybeans, now we've got 2 sets of roots. We're going to greatly increase the organic matter and some of the root exudates that are in that soil. Management does have an impact on the soil. So as we look at these, are these the same soil type? Well, they sure don't look like it, but the answer is yes. It all goes back to management. You look at Dave's soil on the left-hand side, he's been doing no-till for 20 years, been using extensive cover crops, and that soil is becoming almost like a mollisol soil, okay, because of all the root turnover, okay? Whereas the soil on the right, exact same soil type, but now it's kind of transitioning to a different type of soil. It's not as good as what we would call the one on the left's transitioning to a mollisol. The one on the right is being downgraded because it just doesn't have that organic matter in the soil. And that's because the tillage that was done for the last 75 to 100 years on that farm. These soils are only 30 feet apart, okay, side-by-side fields. Soil compaction is a biological and man-made problem. Poor soil structure is related to the lack of living roots in the soil profile, and really soil compaction is just poor soil structure due to that lack of roots, okay? You've got to have more roots. If you want to improve your soil, just keep adding more organic matter and having those live roots, and that will make your soil better. Here's some information on subsoiling and compaction that we did at Ohio State University. Some research has been done over the last 20 to 30 years. Most of this research was done by Randall Reeder. Randall Reeder's now retired. So this was our Hoytville experiment station where we had Hoytville heavy clay soils. And we found out that where we subsoiled, we got gains and losses. So if we had a conventional tilled soil and we subsoiled it, the corn yield, we get a gain of about 1 to 3 bushel, or about 3%, okay? On the soybean yield, the gain was a little higher, 2 to 5 bushel, or about 10%. But we also had soils that were just no-till, and we would go in there and subsoil them, and what would happen? We'd actually get a yield loss. The corn yield would go down. It'd be 1 to 3 bushel less, 3% drop, and on the soybean yields, it was just the exact opposite of what happened where we subsoiled. And I think the reason for this is we weren't using cover crops. And when you subsoil a soil that's a little wet, what you end up doing is you smear the sidewalls and you actually cause more damage. The best time to subsoil, if you're going to subsoil, is when that soil is absolutely dry. But it takes more horsepower. And really, does a subsoiler give us organic matter? No, it burns organic matter. It's a little slower, but adding a cover crop can do the same thing, and it adds organic matter to the soil. So what does the subsoiling do versus a cover crop? Gives us immediate change in soil structure, 18 inches deep. That's probably about as deep as you're going to go. It will increase infiltration short term, but it leaves that soil susceptible to compaction and to erosion later. And it's also going to burn up your organic matter, okay? What about subsoiling versus a cover crop? What can it do for us? It's going to have a little slower change in soil structure. It might take 2 to 3 years, but it'll take out about 1 foot of compaction every year. So it can go down 3 feet or deeper. It increases your water infiltration over time. It protects the soil from erosion. It will tie up and add nutrients and organic matter to your soil. It fits really well into a continuous no-till system, and it helps protect that soil against compaction and erosion by having those live roots out there. Here's just kind of a whole listing of all the different systems that we have out there. And starting at the bottom, this would be a subsoiled field, deep ripped, full surface tillage. That's going to be the worst case scenario. You go to a moldboard plow or chisel plowing and finally tilled seed bed. And then as we start to move up, now we're just subsoiling with wide space shanks and then strip tilling. Now we're only tilling just a small portion of that soil. Then we go to shallow tillage with the airway, the Phoenix Harrow. Intermittent no-till, that would be kind of your rotational no-till. And then it kind of depends on how much residue. If we have light residue on a bare ground versus heavy residue with no cover crop, and then continuous no-till with a growing cover crop. And then the ultimate situation is where we do continuous no-till, controlled traffic, and a cover crop. That's going to give us the best soil structure over time. Okay, so these are the way that we kind of looked at this system. Here's a really neat slide from Stuart Dykert. I enhanced it. Stuart had 4 fields that were very close together. So in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see this subsoiled field. And that soil that was subsoiled and heavily tilled, he took the same size truck that was filled with grain across it. And what he found is that the ruts were about 6 to 12 inches. Well, we went to a no-till field that was close by, and the ruts in that field were only 3 to 6 inches. That was after 1 year of no-till. Then if you go to the upper right-hand corner, a 2-year no-till, what happened? Well, now the ruts are only half as deep as what the previous slide was. So now the ruts are only 1 to 2 inches deep. And then when you go to a long-term no-till, you can barely see the cracks. Well, the interesting thing when we go to describe these soils, especially when we have a wet spring, what are these soils like? Well, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, I'm going to use highly technical terms here. It's really squishy when it's wet, and it gets hard as a rock when it's dry. Okay, you'll break your fingernails off, and then you got these rocks. It has no structural stability. But you compare that to the upper left-hand corner where we have long-term no-till. It's firm when it's wet. You can actually get across that field, and it's soft when it's dry. I've had a number of farmers the last 3-4 years that were able to get their crops planted even when they had a light rain because they had structural stability. You can't do that on a conventional tilled soils because the mud is flying and you'll get stuck. Okay, so again, this shows what's going on with compaction. Some of the best cover crops to fight compaction and improve our soil structure. The grasses are by far probably some of the best. The sorghum sudan, the annual ryegrass, the cereal rye, and the oats. Sorghum sudan is by far one of the best ones. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But let your sorghum sudan get about 3 feet high, mow it off or feed it, and you'll get 5 to 10 times more roots. I've had a number of farmers that were dairy farmers that used to plow their sorghum sudan maybe 20, 30 years ago. And they said every time they would plow a sorghum sudan field, they never get a plow furrow. The ground would so mellow, it would just fall apart. There's really no need to till it because you have really good soil structure. Other crops that are really good are our brassicas, especially the daikon radish, the white radish. Turnips are very shallow rooted. They're not as good. Just remember on those daikon radish, half the volume is not in that root. It's actually in the very fine root hairs. So if you've got a huge radish out there, you just really need to take it times 2 with all the roots that are out there. A lot of them you can't see, but there's a lot of very fine roots out there that help to loosen up our soil. When we're looking at legumes, there's a whole slew of legumes that are very good. The hairy vetch, the cowpeas, the polenta is a new one. I'll talk more about that in another session. The red clover, the sweet clover, and the winter peas. They're all very good. They all go down anywhere from 24, even 36 inches in the soil, and they add nitrogen to our soil. If you're looking just for surface compaction, probably buckwheat is a little bit better than Phacelia. Most of the buckwheat, the roots are going to be in the top 3 to 4, maybe 5 inches. And if you really want to have deep compaction, sunflowers are probably one of the best crops that we have for breaking up deep compaction. Those roots go down quite deep in the soil. So here's a summary of what we've talked about, and then we'll do some demos. Soil compaction is related to the biology of the soil and how that soil is managed. Tillage influences how much soil organic matter we have, how many microbes are in the soil, especially whether we're bacteria dominated with tillage, or if we do no-till and have undisturbed soils, we're going to have a balance of both fungus and bacteria that will allow us to form more macroaggregates. And that's going to have a huge impact on soil structure and soil compaction. Cold no-till soils are the result of soil compaction and poor soil structure. Once we start to no-till that soil and get more live roots in there, we can make that soil be warm and moist, not cold and wet. And it's the active living roots and the microbes. They're all working together to improve that soil structure. This is kind of like their home. And the better, they really like oxygen, having a little bit of oxygen, not too much, and allowing to have adequate moisture in the soil. So they're always working to improve their home. No-till plus a cover crop equals a new system. I like to call this ecological farming or eco-farming. The NRCS now calls this a soil health management system. And with that, I'm going to end my talk for right now, and then we're going to do a couple of demos. Hello. We're going to do 2 demos for the soil compaction. So again, my name is Jim Hoorman, and I'm going to show you a couple clods. Hopefully you can see these, and we'll try not to make too much of a mess. But these are some soil that I got from a couple of fields, and this is from a conventional soil. And as you look at this clod, you'll notice that there's not a whole lot of pore space. Now, let's take a look at a soil that's been in long-term no-till with the cover crop. And you can see there's the old cover crop. You'll notice there's a little bit more pore space. So what we're going to do is we're going to do something called the slake test. So we're going to put both of these in the water, and we'll notice what happens, okay? So I'm going to hold these up, and what do we see on the left-hand side? We'll notice that the conventional soil, and the reason I like to use this particular soil is it really slakes fast. You'll notice that as I'm standing here holding this one right over here is falling apart. Now, I can put the same kind of stress on this one, and notice the glues in the soil are allowing that soil to hold together. And I can leave these clods in this water for 24 hours. After just a few minutes, this one will be completely dissolved. Matter of fact, it's almost gone. If I shake it just a little bit, look at that go. Now look at, I'm going to shake this one. And because we've got a few, but those are microaggregates that are sloughing off. They're not your microaggregates. This one is mainly microaggregates. This one is mainly macroaggregates, okay? And you can see as that goes down, look at how clear the water is on the right-hand side. So when it rains, if you don't have good water infiltration, what's going to happen on a tilled soil? You're going to get a lot of nutrients being lost in that soil, okay? Now, I'm going to do another little demo, and we're going to talk about how these soil particles are held together. So notice I have a brick and a sponge. Clay, this brick is made out of clay. And if we look, we can talk a little bit about the density. So which of these would you prefer that I throw at you? Okay, now most people will say the sponge, but look at it. It has the same volume, almost exactly the same volume, but this one's lighter, so it has less of a bulk density, okay? So when we look at these bricks, let's think a little bit about how this brick was made, okay? So what did we do? We took subsoil, and we put it in a furnace, and what we did is we burned off the organic matter, and then we let it dry, and it gets really hard, okay? So what do we call a brick laying on top of the soil? We call that a clod. And here's the reason that clods form. These clay particles have a positive ion in there, and if you put a positive ion, like say my fist in there, if I put those two together, this is going to set up like a brick wall, okay? So I'm sure everybody's seen this. Have you ever noticed a farmer that will go out and they will just till their soil and get it really, really fine? What happens after it rains? That soil will set up like a brick wall, and you'll have a lot of ponding water, and you won't have very much water infiltration, okay? So those are the microaggregates. These individual clay particles are microaggregates. When we start to add the organic matter and we get all the root exudates, now we're going to form something called a macroaggregate. Macroaggregates are going to allow the air and the water to go down through the soil. So that's our soil health demonstrations. We did the slake test, and we did the bricks through the sponge. Have a good day.